sovereign governments in their entirety. The paper lays out in detail how China has developed standardized contracts containing extreme provisions squarely aimed at the dual goals of protecting its investment and exercising its sovereign power. China seeks to climb the seniority ladder through strict non-disclosure agreements and so-called, quote, no Paris Club clauses, tying borrowing countries' hands in restructuring debts or even acknowledging that debts exist. The contracts contain provisions requiring collateral accounts that are held offshore and off the government's books. And China seeks to expand its sphere of influence by using acceleration and cross-default clauses to impose their policy preferences on borrower nations, going as far as canceling unrelated loans when borrowing nations make policy decisions that China opposes. Given that lack of clarity around exactly how much is owed to Chinese entities and the terms of those agreements, other lenders face uncertainty about their level of seniority and the full extent of the borrowing country's debt servicing costs. This lack of transparency makes future debt restructuring efforts, many of which we're seeing get underway right now, that much more difficult. The Debt Services Suspension Initiative and the Common Framework are both positive developments in ensuring international cooperation in addressing sovereign debt issues. Most notably, the Common Framework brings China closer to agreeing to Paris Club-style coordination. However, there remain significant hurdles to putting developing countries on a sustainable debt path. As China continues to expand its lending throughout the world, it is more important than ever that the United States and our global partners lead in setting durable global norms for official bilateral lending. With that, I'd like to thank our panel of witnesses whose expertise in this field is unparalleled. I sincerely appreciate your assistance in tackling these difficult issues and look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Chairman Himes, thank you. Chair Waters, it's good to have you in our discussion today. We appreciate your leadership on the bipartisan agenda as it relates to reviewing China's engagement as the world's largest creditor. It's a bipartisan concern, and our committee has made that clear through enacting legislation like the Export-Import Bank's most recent reauthorization, as well as my Ensuring Chinese Debt Transparency Act that was passed last Congress. Multilateralism means bringing Beijing into compliance with international rules of the road, including those of the Paris Club. Recent research, including some of our witnesses today, has filled many important details in on the scope, opacity, and conditionality of Chinese lending, which clearly runs counter to the mission of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other multilateral lenders. This is unacceptable. Let me highlight 3 policy implications I believe result from China's Belt and Road lending. First, the U.S. and our allies need to be much more serious about pushing for real concessions from Beijing. Many know that I've raised questions about the Treasury's recent plan to allocate $650 billion in special drawing rights, which could facilitate directly or indirectly Belt and Road repayments. This could also make it more challenging to force China to the negotiating table. Even if you support an SDR allocation, we should all be able to agree that the Treasury should use its leverage to obtain meaningful agreement on debt before signing off at the IMF meeting this summer, and not afterwards, when China could end up leading us into endless talks with zero results. 30 years of failure to protect intellectual property, and the recent suspension of 8 years of fruitless discussions by Treasury and our allies on transparency of China's export credit market should remind us just how typical and real that danger is. A meaningful agreement on debt would entail specific long-term concessions on transparency and appropriate coverage of all China's official creditors, not just the ones they claim are arms of the government. We also must consider whether or not the G20's common framework for debt treatment should expand to cover additional borrowers. The time for the U.S. and its allies to nail down these formal commitments is right now, not after an allocation when the urgency of COVID-19 economic downturn begins to fade. Second, we need to find an alternative to developing countries' acceptance of Chinese lending. Much of Chinese credit to low-income countries is at relatively high rates with short maturities and in some cases requires onerous collateral requirements and cross-default provisions. Loans may be also linked to a country's diplomatic treatment of Taiwan or some other policy at odds with U.S. interests. At the IFIs, Treasury needs flexibility to weigh these kinds of considerations strategically and use the mandates it has to make the IFIs as nimble and effective as possible. Finally, Beijing's resistance to international lending rules, not to speak of the abuse of basic human values in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, once again highlights that it does not deserve more of a voice in the international financial institutions. Shareholding is not just about a country's size of economy. It's about the commitments and contributions to multilateral cooperation. We can't wish this away by believing that the IMF quota for China or the status of the RMB in the SDR basket are things that can entice Beijing into better behavior. It simply hasn't worked, and we must adopt by focusing more countries on the interests that align with ours. I look forward to our panel today, and I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend, the ranking member, and I now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, the gentlewoman from California, for 1 minute.
Thank you so very much, Chair Himes. I'm so pleased about your leadership on this issue and your bipartisan efforts. Today, we will discuss how we can prevent a pandemic-induced series of sovereign debt crisis and how we can bring international norms and principles to China and its investments around the world. Last Congress, I had the benefit of learning about China's Belt and Road Initiative directly from our military leadership in the United States Africa Command. When I traveled to Germany, the conclusion I drew was that addressing these challenges can only be accomplished with United States leadership through coordinated and thoughtful multilateral action. So I'm pleased we finally have that leadership in the White House with President Joe Biden, and I hope this hearing is informative to not just the public, but to his administration as well. Thank you so very much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm told that the ranking member, Mr. McHenry, is not present and doesn't claim his minute. Let me give him a second to object or forever hold his peace. Okay, sounds like Mr. McHenry is not there. So today we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First today we have Mr. Scott Morris, a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. Next we have Professor Odette Lanau, the Associate Dean of Faculty Research and Intellectual Life at Cornell University Law School. Next we have Jaime Atienza, the Debt Policy Lead at Oxfam. Next, we have Professor Anna Gelpern, the Anne Fleming Research Professor at Georgetown Law and non-resident senior fellow at the Peter G. Peterson Institute for International Economics. And finally, we have Dr. Sebastian Horn, an economist at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left, and a chime will go off at the end of your time. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony if you hear the chime so that we can be respectful both of the witnesses and the committee members' time. Just as a reminder, it's the practice of the subcommittee to allow witnesses to finish their answers, but we do not permit members to go much beyond their 5 minutes to finish a question or to elicit a question. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Morris, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. 25 years ago, this committee was instrumental in putting forward the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative, or HIPIC, to relieve the debt burdens of 37 low-income countries. At the time, the U.S. government was one of the leading creditors to these countries, while China was a smaller creditor than Costa Rica. Today, nearly all of the HIPIC countries are again at risk of debt distress, with vulnerabilities that have been greatly exacerbated by the pandemic. But on the creditor side, the picture has changed dramatically. The US government today is one of the smallest creditors to these countries, while China, on the other hand, is a bigger creditor than all other government creditors combined. So when we consider how best to address a potential wide-scale debt crisis, we have to grapple with China's dominant position. Not just how much China lends, but how China lends. I'll focus the balance of my remarks on the findings of a new report on China's lending practices, as evidenced by their debt contracts, as well as U.S. responses to these practices. I co-authored this report with Anna Gelpern and Sebastian Horn, both also on the panel today, as well as Brad Parks and Christoph Trebisch. 4 main insights emerged from our research. First, China's contracts contain unusual confidentiality clauses that bar borrowers from revealing the terms or even the existence of the debt. These restrictions are problematic. They impede budget transparency, they hide the borrower's true financial condition from its other creditors, and they can serve as an obstacle to timely and orderly debt restructurings. Second, Chinese lenders seek advantage over other creditors through collateral arrangements, such as lender-controlled revenue accounts. Accounts of this sort encumber scarce foreign exchange and fiscal resources of developing country governments. And when the accounts are hidden through strict non-disclosure requirements, they can distort the overall economic picture for a country in the eyes of the IMF and other creditors. Again, such arrangements may serve as a barrier to timely and efficient debt restructurings. Third, Chinese lenders also seek advantage over other creditors through requirements to keep the debt out of collective restructuring efforts. Such clauses unambiguously seek to set Chinese creditors apart from and ahead of other creditors in restructuring situations. Fourth, cancellation and acceleration clauses in Chinese contracts have broad scope and imply significant policy leverage over the borrowing country. These provisions enable the Chinese lender to accelerate payment or cancel a loan due to a wide array of policy conditions in the borrowing country or in China. With these findings in mind, let me turn to the U.S. government's policy agenda. In responding to China, I would urge you to keep the interests of developing countries in mind, particularly during the current crisis. These countries need extraordinary support right now, and the U.S. government should work with partners to mobilize as much aid and concessional financing as possible. The U.S. is already stepping up with direct support for COVID relief and access to vaccines for these countries, and the faster we can move on these measures, the better. We should continue to support institutions like the World Bank and the IMF in their efforts in these countries. Our financial contributions to these institutions are critical. The U.S. should have clear objectives when it comes to China's role in debt relief. As the largest of the government lenders to indebted countries, the Chinese government should bear the largest cost of any debt relief initiative, but that outcome will not be automatic. The U.S. should work with other countries on a more comprehensive definition of government creditors, such that Chinese government-owned lenders are not shielded from debt relief commitments. The U.S. should also insist that the Chinese government disavow contractual provisions that impede debt relief efforts. Our government should lead by example when it comes to government contract transparency. The degree of secrecy we observe in Chinese contracts is unusual, but the reality is that secrecy is the prevailing norm among government lenders. While the burden of transparency has fallen almost exclusively on borrowing countries to date, the U.S. could lead in expanding this agenda to creditor governments as well. That should start with a commitment to publish government-to-government debt contracts where the U.S. government is a creditor. Finally, as the U.S. seeks to compete with China in offering development finance, our government should be vigilant about avoiding China's mistakes in lending imprudently into vulnerable environments. There's no doubt the U.S. government could be doing more to support infrastructure projects in developing countries, but doing so in a manner that protects the U.S. taxpayer and benefits these countries will require focusing on measures of project quality and safeguards, financing terms that are appropriate to the country's circumstances, and strong alignment with the IMF and the World Bank in their financing frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Ms. Lanau, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. The United States faces a turning point in the international debt architecture for 2 reasons. First, pandemic-related debt distress will be a multi-year issue. This means that the international community is currently paying closer attention to these problems. There may be greater appetite to put in place necessary changes. Second, the global balance of economic power is likely to shift in the coming decades. The U.S. has been the central actor in international finance for 50 years. This will not necessarily be the case forever, so it should act today to cement its values going forward. In the remainder of my remarks, I want to emphasize three ways that the problematic elements of Chinese lending practices fit into broader sovereign debt concerns. First, these lending practices do not exist in a vacuum. They reflect and amplify general and endemic issues. These include a lack of transparency in loan terms and conditions, insufficient concern for whether debt actually benefits a country's underlying population, and a lack of comprehensive creditor participation. The practices of certain Chinese creditors take these general defects to the extreme. Still, the best way to constrain troublesome practices by one country is to establish norms relevant to all countries. Otherwise, efforts to constrain problematic actors are unlikely to stick. This has been a key principle of the post-World War II global order, and it remains essential. Therefore, any efforts to improve Chinese lending practices must be part of broader progress in the debt architecture. Second, if the US is concerned with China's increasing role in international capital flows, it should work now to solidify values of transparency, accountability, public benefit, and comprehensive participation. As with any path, this begins with an initial step. The US should commit to supporting a swift, stable, and equitable public health and financial recovery from the pandemic. This will be essential to a full global economic recovery and also help to forestall follow-on consequences, such as political instability and disruptive migration patterns. In the medium term, the US should implement widely accepted lending and restructuring principles across multiple tracks, including contract term improvements, domestic legislation, and international initiatives. This matters whether creditors are private investors or government actors, especially when these categories are starting to blur. For long-term progress, the US should consider the establishment of an independent authority to facilitate these improvements. Especially given the potential changes in the global balance of power, an independent authority committed to broadly acknowledged principles could be helpful. My third and final point involves corruption and mismatched financial incentives in a number of borrowing countries. Greater tolerance of corruption may be a problem in some Chinese contracts, and again, this issue implicates broader and long-standing dynamics in international finance, where the decisions of borrower elites may not always reflect the interests of their citizens. This means two key things. First, we should not punish countries' populations when dealing with the pandemic and the related debt crisis, even if elites have made financial mistakes. It makes sense to promote transparency and responsible lending now, but the most vulnerable will suffer the most from inaction. Second, US and other international actors must take the lead in implementing and modeling new norms and practices. We sometimes hear that debtor countries are primarily responsible for transparency and other reforms, and that's true. But ruling elites in these countries may prefer to foot drag, while their citizens often do not have the information or the power to take action. So, given the power imbalances and information asymmetries on the ground, more needs to be done at the external level. US support for strong creditor-focused rules on transparency and lending could, over time, help undermine troublesome internal dynamics in sovereign borrowers. To conclude, I should note that meaningful reforms may not be fully embraced by all US stakeholders. Some American affiliates have also benefited from deficiencies in the international framework. So, if the US is serious about curbing problematic debt practices, it will have to make that commitment clear to domestic constituencies as well. This will not always be an easy choice. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Lanao. Mr. Atienza, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the committee, good morning and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jaime Atienza and I come to this committee as the Global Debt Policy Lead of the Oxfam Confederation. The timing of this session is critical, as we have seen the debt situation, especially of the poorest countries, worsen significantly in recent years and even more after the COVID hit. In February 2020, before the pandemic was declared, the IMF stated that over half of low-income countries in Africa were either in debt distress or at high risk of being so, and things have only worsened since. Debts, both with China and with private creditors represent the largest threat to their economic options for recovery. So both need to be tackled to bring in effective solutions. The human impact of a debt crisis is often overlooked. Higher spending on debt means lower spending on public services, which means fewer teachers, health workers, and hospital beds for hundreds of millions of citizens in need. It also means further entrenching the cycle of poverty for many, the impacts of which fall particularly hard on women, as unpaid care work must often fill the gaps. The impact of COVID-19 in Africa has been profound, with a 10-year setback in poverty, a steep rise in hunger, and desperation leading to more migration. Small island states, among them some in the Caribbean, have lost an average 13% of their GDP, a wartime loss that is boosting poverty. In large part, because of their debt burdens, poor countries are unable to redeploy their resources to the most urgent needs. In advanced economies such as the United States, the use of expansive monetary policies or large debt purchasing programs allowed a wide range of policy actions to cope with the crisis, protect those worse off, and prepare for the future stage of recovery. On the contrary, in the poorest countries, the situation is dire and options are scarce. In April 2021, 1 month after the pandemic was declared by the WHO, a global initiative called the DSSI was launched by the G20. It allowed for up to 23 countries to receive, upon request, a temporary suspension of their bilateral debt repayments from China to the United States. But this initiative left to voluntary mechanisms any debt relief from private creditors, which has not materialized at all, and simply invited IFIs to find ways to contribute more. The IMF did mobilize resources to cover debt repayments that 29 low-income countries owed to the fund, something the World Bank still has yet to accomplish. However, Oxfam research shows that 84% of COVID-era loans by the fund encourage or require austerity measures, which strike at the very fiscal space needed for recovery. Overall, design flaws with DSSI have meant that only 46 of the 73 eligible countries requested any debt suspension. And at the end of 2020, only 5.7 billion of debt repayments were suspended, with almost 90% of those repayments still flowing out of poor indebted nations. The moratorium has failed to give enough fiscal space for the poorest nations in response to COVID and essentially has postponed the crisis. The common framework holds more promise, but it's yet to be tested, and the kind of debt relief it will deliver is unclear. It excludes middle-income countries, and the prospects for the comparability of treatment clause to deliver debt relief by private creditors remains uncertain at best. The situation for developing countries, and specifically for low and low middle-income African economies and small island states, in particular those in the Caribbean, is very urgent. And at a minimum, we need to take forward the following actions: ensuring debt cancellation options under the common framework for DSSI countries as well as middle-income countries in deep trouble; ensuring legal protection to debtor countries from the potential risks of debt holdouts after debt restructuring; accelerating new grant and concessional financing to countries that are unable to use their own resources or use new debt as advanced economies can; bring forward truly collaborative efforts under the G20 umbrella of the common framework between major creditors, including China and the US, IFIs and private bondholders and banks; upgrade transparency and disclosure of all debt contracts in collaboration with the OECD, including civil society and public oversight; and finally, agreeing to sustainable borrowing and lending standards to be applied to new operations and include catastrophe clauses in new debt contracts to avoid situations as the current. Again, thanks very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Atienza. Ms. Gilpern, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, Chairman Waters, and members of the committee. It's a privilege to be here and talk about both the next steps for financial architecture reform as well as the role of China. And I'm happy to answer questions along with my co-authors about the China lending paper. So COVID-19 is both an alarm bell and an opening for meaningful reform of international financial architecture, and debt architecture in particular. And this is one of those few times where the word architecture actually means architecture and not sort of frittering around with interior decoration and changing the doorknobs. Today's crises are quite different from the crises we saw 2 decades ago when there was another flurry of architecture conversations. This is not the last pandemic. We're going to see climate disasters and public health and financial shocks that are going to call for very different kinds of responses than what we've seen so far. The actors are very different today. Many of them have no experience in and at best provisional commitment to multilateral crisis resolution. And here, I think Chad, for one random example, it's the first common framework country. Its biggest creditor, almost half the debt, is Glencore, a mining company. Its biggest official creditor is China, followed by, of all countries, Libya, France, Angola, India, Saudi Arabia. This is not the old bonds versus banks, hedge funds versus city conversation. Debt stocks are much bigger, more fragile, much more complex. There's more collateralized debt, and it's inexcusably untransparent. Against this background, the common framework is real progress. It is a real architectural move. It's a new room. It's a turret, perhaps. It does need support. It's worth investing in. It also needs oversight to live up to its potential. Now, China found it in its interest to participate, as did India, as did other big creditors. And I think that, above all, is a really hopeful sign. I am, on balance, optimistic. So I'm testifying here purely in my personal capacity, but I did want to highlight for the members some takeaways from a Group of 30 report on sovereign debt and financing for post-COVID recovery, which does focus on next steps in debt architecture reform. In particular, I think many of us are on the same page. The common framework should be open to any country in debt distress, not just the poorest. It's a problem to have just the poorest countries be eligible, both because it marginalizes and kind of the common framework as a mechanism, but also because it creates a stigma that I think would be very undesirable going forward in the architecture project. The common framework has to establish a record of transparency, equity, and consistency from the very start. So this means that creditors have to renounce the debt terms that conflict with their common framework commitments. Now, you can always waive the contract terms if you're a creditor, right? There's nothing magical about the G20 standing up and saying, we're not going to enforce these terms that my colleagues and I have found, particularly the No Paris Club term, and certainly confidentiality provisions. Comparability, which Mr. Atienza mentioned, is essential. And that, by the way, should make this whole distraction of a conversation about who is an official and who's a private creditor, it should make it go away. I don't care if you're official, I don't care if you're private, everyone has got to contribute to comparable debt relief. And that, I think, is essential. Going forward, we're going to see a lot more hybrid creditors, and we don't want to waste time on this sort of thing. There should be public disclosure, and there's got to be something like a standing consultative coordinating body to ensure that this ad hoc restructuring is not seen as illegitimate, is not conducted behind closed doors. My colleagues already mentioned, and I agree wholeheartedly, that the US and other G20 have got to lead by example and disclose our bilateral contracts. And very last point, my big fear from the China lending paper is that we're going to see an arms race. Every creditor is going to want some collateral. Everyone is going to want priority. We've got to nip this in the bud. We've got to start with multilateral agreement that we're not going to dismember distressed countries and engage in an asset grab race. That's not a way to build an architecture. Thank you very much.
Ms. Gelpern. Dr. Horn, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I would like to use my time to highlight findings from a recent research project with Carmen Reinhardt and Christoph Trebesch. And I would also like to share my personal views on why I believe that greater debt transparency needs to be a cornerstone in all efforts to reform the international debt architecture. Over the course of the past 15 years, the Chinese government and its state-owned enterprises and banks have lent at least $500 billion to developing and emerging market countries. This lending boom has turned the Chinese government into the world's largest official creditor, with outstanding claims surpassing those of the IMF, those of the World Bank, or those of all Paris Club members combined. Chinese overseas lending has filled a void left by traditional development donors and has contributed to meeting the enormous funding gap for infrastructure and reliable energy sources in the developing world. This has potentially large positive effects on economic growth and development. At the same time, outstanding debt to Chinese creditors has risen fast and has contributed to debt servicing difficulties in multiple developing and emerging countries. For the 50 most indebted developing countries to China, we estimate that outstanding debt stocks have risen from almost zero in 2005 to an average of more than 15% of GDP in 2017. In more than 24 developing countries, outstanding debt stocks to China now exceed 10% of recipient country GDP. The large majority of loans has been extended at commercial terms, meaning with interest rates that are close to those in private capital markets, and with comparatively short grace periods and maturities. As a result, Chinese creditors are going to play a dominant role in debt service payments of many low and middle income countries for years to come. Furthermore, the opacity surrounding Chinese lending practices has made it difficult to assess the exact debt burdens of recipient countries. Our analysis reveals that around 50% of Chinese lending to developing country public sector recipients has gone unreported, meaning that these debt stocks do not appear in the most widely used data sources provided by the World Bank and other international organizations. The unreported lending from China has grown to more than $200 billion as of 2016. Most of these liabilities are held on the books of state-owned enterprises and special purpose vehicles and are therefore outside the often narrowly drawn perimeter of public debt statistics. Hidden debt problems are widespread and not exclusively linked to Chinese lending. However, the opacity of the Chinese lending process has fueled the buildup of the problem, and Chinese authorities so far have done little to address the issue. The Chinese government does not publish detailed statistics on its outstanding claims and lending activities and does not share information with the OECD creditor reporting system or the Paris Club. Furthermore, Chinese state-owned banks often exclude expansive confidentiality undertakings in their loan contracts and thus prevent the debtors from revealing the terms or even the existence of the loans. Failing to account for unreported debts distorts the views of the official and private sectors in significant ways. Uncertainty about the amount and terms of outstanding claims undermines debt sustainability analysis and asset pricing and leads to longer and ultimately more costly debt restructuring processes. These problems are aggravated by the fact that a substantial share of Chinese loans relies on formal and informal means of collateralization, so that Chinese creditors may be treated preferentially in case of repayment problems. Maybe most importantly, the lack of transparency prevents citizens in both the borrower and creditor countries from holding their governments accountable for their borrowing and lending decisions. Exposing public debt to public scrutiny can help to reduce the risks of unsustainable debt buildups and helps to mitigate the severity of recurring cycles of debt and crisis. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed debt vulnerabilities in developing countries, along with the deficiencies of the international debt architecture. Broad action on that is needed to ensure that developing countries can mobilize the resources they require to address the ongoing health crisis. While greater debt transparency alone cannot overcome all issues, it is a prerequisite to broader attempts to reform the international debt architecture. The best way for advanced countries to support such efforts is to lead by example. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Ms. Gelper, let me start with you. My experience is that underwriting documents and contracts usually include representations and warranties that forbid a borrower from assuming additional debt that is senior to that debt, and would create a technical default if that occurs. My understanding is that at a minimum, a lender will expect to be asked for consent to for a borrower to take on debt that is senior to that debt. So my question is, first of all, do you have any sense for how widespread Chinese lending that may actually be creating technical defaults is? And secondly, how do both the Chinese and the borrowers, who are presumably knowingly getting into a technical default, think about undertaking that kind of activity?
What a fantastic question. Sorry, I'm a contracts professor, so I'm loving this. The clauses you're talking about, so pari passu and negative pledge clauses, are very widespread, but their formulation varies tremendously. So while I think it's a healthy assumption that a lot of this debt violates traditional negative pledge clauses, the carve-outs are so broad and the variation is so wide that it's not entirely clear how much of this lending triggers technical default. Also, what we found, and my colleagues can elaborate, is not so much formal collateralization as just a contractual promise to route funds in a certain way. You may recall we did this with, when we did an emergency loan for Mexico in the United States in the mid-90s, and it's just a contractual commitment. Now, ours was in the open and politically very controversial in both countries. The trouble here is that these bank accounts are, many of them are behind the veil of confidentiality, so people don't know. The answer is
thank you, Ms. Gelper. Let me not to be rude here, but I want to get one or two more questions before I run out of time. Dr. Horn, you intrigued me with the last thing that you said. That one thing we could do is actually set a good example. The Chinese are famously resistant to moral suasion or to abiding by otherwise generally accepted international norms. So I open this to Dr. Horn to start, but would love to get a more broad answer. What leverage does the rest of the world really have? I'm not talking again about just moral suasion. I'm talking about what leverage do we really have to bring the Chinese into a more multilateral framework for this sort of lending?
Now, in addition to leading by example, I think the most powerful way in this regard would be to work to the debtor countries and require them to have robust debt disclosure laws in their domestic laws that requires them to publish lending contracts if they themselves take them up as part of the debt disclosure process. I think that would be beneficial for the borrowers and would have this effect of creating a standard that debt needs to be public in order to enter into effect.
Any other thoughts on leverage that the rest of the world may have to achieve that end?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think I share to some degree your skepticism. I do think it is about using the multilateral settings that we have. As Anna Gelper noted, the G20 Common Framework is a step forward. So it's a matter of how do we build on that. And this agenda, which I think all of us have pointed to around transparency, really is a critical piece of the next steps. And no, I agree. There's no guarantee that China is going to get on board quickly, but I do think, part of the process is that we demonstrate a willingness ourselves to take this on, and then we push very aggressively, certainly in the G20, but also in the IMF, the World Bank. These are institutions where China is the third largest shareholder, and I think we can rightly point to the obligations of the leading shareholders to do the right thing here.
Thank you. Mr. Atienza, very quickly, the equilibrium clauses that Professor Gelper and Mr. Morris and Dr. Horn wrote about, they would appear to have perhaps a chilling effect on the implementation of new environmental and labor laws in countries that borrow from China. Do you share that concern?
So I think I really believe that what my colleagues say is a true concern that needs to be factored in. And I just want to say that it's important to try and find frameworks where China will join others, but leading by example is not enough. I made the point that we need the privates to be part of the mix. And Dr. Gelper mentioned too, if we want them to be part of efforts that are broader, it's not only about bilateral. They, for their size, compete with others that are in this mix, and it's not just governments. So I think that's a direction to take. Ensure everybody is sitting around the table, and then there will be a better option of pushing China forward as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Atienza. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Himes. And again, thank you for this very constructive panel, and thank all the witnesses for their excellent commentary. I've shared my concerns time and time again about, is China really going to come forward and be a constructive partner in the debt relief efforts? In speaking with the Treasury Secretary and others, people, including today, have celebrated that China has said, well, we'll participate in the common framework. And I'm not saying that's not encouraging. That's certainly a good small step, but as with so many things with China, trust but verify is important. In your very good study that our witnesses have drafted today, there's a reference to a contract with Argentina, between Argentina and the China Development Bank, and it says, the borrower shall under no circumstances bring or agree to submit the obligations under the finance documents to the Paris Club for restructuring, or into any debt reduction plan of the IMF, World Bank, or any other multilateral international financial institution to which the state, Argentina, is a part of, or the government of the PRC without prior written consent of the lender. So does that sound like, Mr. Morris, somebody who is ready to participate in the Paris Club?
Congressman, that provision in particular is clearly at odds with what the Chinese government has committed to under the common framework, and which is why I think for the U.S. government, it ought to be a priority to get a very explicit disavowal of those kinds of provisions, both in the existing contracts, but also a commitment not to use those kinds of provisions going forward. But you're absolutely right. It creates a clear conflict, and particularly a burden for the borrowing country here, where they are making a contractual commitment to a Chinese lender that is at odds with their own obligations to other creditors and to the multilateral institutions.
Right, and is not in their long-term interest. I mean, the Chinese loans might be expedient by rate or shortness of terms, but they come with these unprecedented non-disclosed features that we've seen turn into an utter disaster in Zambia, in Ecuador, in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, and the list goes on, which everyone here certainly knows. Would you say that the G7 countries, our finance ministers and our leaders, including President Biden, should have that as a part of the G7 meeting where they say that they will together press China for this kind of transparency?
I agree with that completely. I think, while there's ultimately, we aim for progress in the G20 because China would make commitments there. I think to get there, we need very coordinated and cohesive efforts by the G7 countries, which are going to be much more like-minded on these issues.
Yeah, I agree. I just don't see how within the IMF framework there's any real enforcement capability here. I see transparency, and I like the idea of a register on the SDR's transfer, for example. But we have to educate our friends in the developing world on what's a good loan versus a bad loan. One other comment, maybe Dr. Horn on this one. In your paper, you show this non-disclosure chart, which I found very interesting. And the red bars are, of course, after 2013. And 2013 is a seminal year as the Chinese Communist leader Xi began Belt and Road being announced in 2013. And suddenly we have all these non-disclosure arrangements in every aspect of your 100 loan sample. Dr. Horn, what are your suggestions for enforcement and how we can encourage Chinese behavioral change? What can the IMF do specifically?
I'm going to repeat myself in a sense, but I think with respect to the confidentiality clauses, again, the most powerful way would be to strengthen the debt management capacity, the statistical capacity in the debtor countries, and make use of the carve-outs that these clauses have. These confidentiality clauses are written in a very broad way, but they usually include a carve-out that allows the debtor countries to publish the contracts and the terms in case there is a domestic law in place that requires them to do so. I think giving them the capacity to put these laws in place would be the most powerful instrument to create transparency.
Thank you, Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chairwoman of the full committee, Mrs. Waters of California, is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, thank you so very much, and I'm appreciating this discussion, and I'm very thankful that our witnesses are here today. Professor Galpern, some people have referred to recent sovereign debt restructurings in which countries like Argentina and Ecuador have had the terms of their debt amended by their creditors to be a success. Continuing with this restructuring argument, however, I think touting these restructurings as successful ignores the pain and suffering that any sovereign debt crisis inflicts on a country's citizens, especially the poor. And let me just say what I think I have learned about some of these agreements that these countries get into. They're desperate. Many of them want to increase their infrastructure. Some of them are trying to increase tourism as an effort to shore up, the economy in their countries. And so while they are desperate and they sign on to these agreements, they don't really anticipate that they're not going to be able to repay the debt and not cause harm to their citizens. So what do you say about their plight and the restructurings, et cetera, et cetera?
Chairwoman, thank you for your question. And I agree wholeheartedly, and not just that you can't measure restructurings success by their speed. You also have to look at actual human beings' well-being, but also just the durability of them. I mean, Argentina and Ecuador are in distress weeks after they restructured, right? And I think reiterating and amplifying some of what my colleagues said, building better capacity and agency in the borrowing countries that do need tremendous infrastructure investment, I think should be an absolute priority. I know transparency can sound like, meaningless sort of pablum, but if you have standardized terms that everyone is aware of, if you know when terms deviate from the standard, if there's multilateral capacity building, I think that we're going to be way better off. I think if countries have these domestic laws that my colleague mentioned, by the way, the carve-outs include laws in other countries. If anybody passes a law requiring disclosure, I think that is going to embarrass a whole lot of creditors into at least somewhat less abusive terms.
Thank you very much. What can be done to incentivize the borrowing countries to seek some help in, dissecting the agreement to see if it's in their best interest and perhaps get some advice before signing off on these agreements?
So I think there's tremendous demand, and this is completely in my different capacity. So we have this initiative called Sovereign Debt Forum, where we have done training sessions with developing country debt managers, and the attendance is very high, right? I think having standard contracts out there, because everybody who gets a contract put in front of them is told, oh, this is perfectly normal. And just like a homeowner that borrows, from a bank and on abusive terms, everybody thinks they're going to repay. and there's genuine humanitarian need, right? So we can't say, well, just stop borrowing.
That's right.
And we need concessional surge capacity at multilaterals. I mean, maybe Mr. Morris can talk some more about that, but there needs to be affordable funding for basic human needs so that countries aren't driven into abusive terms.
Thank you very much. Let me take a moment here to direct a question to Mr. Morris. In the G20's debt service suspension initiative, which temporarily suspends the debt service payments to poor countries to G20 nations, China did not suspend debt service payments to China Development Bank, asserting that the CDB is a commercial entity, despite the fact that it is under the control of the Communist Party State Council. Some of China's contracts you examined in your report contain false default and acceleration clauses to which a default in one China loan in a country would trigger a default across the board on all China loans in the country. Linking all China investments in a country this way suggests as a matter of contract that China is presenting itself as a unitary entity. Mr. Morris, isn't this inconsistent with the Chinese government's propaganda in debt discussions that not all loans, such as those by China Development Bank, are centrally controlled?
Well, thank you, Chair Waters. I think this is a real challenge, and I think, yes, I think our research provides additional evidence that if we're looking at China Development Bank, not only is it unambiguously owned by the Chinese government, but it is a policy lever for the Chinese government. And that ought to add to the burden on China to continue, the argument that it is a commercial bank with no policy ties to the government just doesn't hold up. And so I think the U.S. ought to be pressing aggressively on this point. As Anna Gelpern said, in principle, it shouldn't matter if we have an agreement that all creditors have to be on board, but we know in practice that commercial creditors haven't been participating. So that gives, CDB room to sit on the sidelines on these discussions.
Well, I want to thank you. My time has long since expired, and as we go on with the hearing, perhaps we can get more involvement in this aspect of it. Thank you very much. I yield back to the chair, Mr. Himes. Thank you.
The chairwoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm glad we're having this hearing today because we need to find a way to properly counter the growing influence of China around the world. However, China's centrally controlled command economy is going to make it impossible for the United States to compete in terms of spending. By some estimates, the Belt and Road Initiative is estimated to have funded over 3,000 projects with a total value of over $4 trillion since it was begun. We should not be looking to try to outmatch China in terms of dollars and cents. But what I hope we pay attention to is how China is currently taking advantage of the international financial institutions and examine how we can close some of the loopholes that are being exploited. If we can better understand how China is using these institutions to their benefit, we'll be able to counter some of their influence without breaking the bank. So my first question, Dr. Horn, is to you. Can you talk about some of the ways China is taking advantage of international financial institutions? Dr. Horn?
Yeah, I'm thinking about your question.
Okay.
I'm not perfectly sure what you're referring to.
Well, look, some of the ways how is China taking advantage of international financial institutions?
Well, I think one problematic element that comes back to what Scott Morris just said is the ability of Chinese lenders, and I think that's a flaw of the general international architecture to self-select into specific categories depending on the situation and to seek structural advantages. The self-identification of CDB as an official lender when it comes to tapping international capital markets, but then as a commercial creditor when it comes to burden sharing under the DSI. The SSI is, I think, one example where the sort of discretion is harmful.
Okay, thank you.
Speak to that.
COVID-19 has been devastating to every country across the globe, but particularly for less developed nations. For poor countries that are in need of financing and desperate need of outside investment, this opened up a great opportunity for China to step in and offer assistance. even though China knows they might not get all of their money back, they are investing, and they realize that they will be able to assert influence over the borrowing country. So, Doctor, again, can you talk about how China has been exploiting the COVID-19 pandemic to expand their influence across the globe?
So I think this is not necessarily specific to the COVID pandemic, but I think as a general point, foreign assistance always comes with some form of foreign influence. So that's also true for the case of Chinese official lending overseas. My colleagues from the How China Lend reports have already mentioned a variety of examples in how this sort of political influence plays through the contracts. I think a key issue here is the inclusion of broad acceleration and cancellation clauses that give a lot of bargaining power to the creditor and allow it to impose influence on certain domestic or foreign political issues. I think these sort of contractual provisions are an issue in that context.
Okay. We've heard how China is not transparent with disclosing the details of their lending practices and the problems that is creating within the international system. This is not surprising given China's track record of covering up human rights violations, stealing IP and theft from companies across the world, and silencing dissenting voices across the government. So finally, Mr. Horn, Dr. Horn, with our inability to affect China's behavior in these areas, why do you think that this time will be different as we push for greater transparency in their financial dealings?
Again, I share some of the skepticism that has already been voiced that repeated commitments might not really make a material difference this time. So again, I think the most powerful way to try to create transparency, if the creditors are unwilling to do so, is to really enable the debtors to put out the contracts and the debts and their terms into the public space.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and what time I have, I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This was a great topic, and I appreciate your good work on this. So just before this pandemic, we had an opportunity to travel to quite a few countries in Africa. We went to Mali, Somalia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and the onerous terms of some of this lending by the Chinese Communist Party, by the Chinese government, was not only egregious in terms, but it also, in many cases, as a number of the witnesses have pointed out, those loans were backed by collateral, and in many cases, it was the maritime ports of these countries. So it really controlled the well, not Mali, but in the other countries, it was really almost a sale of part of their maritime ports, which in long term really affects the long-term interest and the national security of those individual countries. We also visited Darwin, Australia, where a private investor with close ties to the Chinese Communist government effectuated a 99-year lease, basically a purchase of the port of Darwin, not very far, about 2 miles from the United States Marines facility there in northern Australia. Is there a way that we might adopt within the common framework a policy or requirement that we discourage or deny the opportunity for the Chinese government to actually acquire this infrastructure, especially when it's so essential to the future of these countries? Many of these countries, especially in Africa, are so desperate for capital, for lending. Some of them, obviously, there's a level of corruption there. But I would just ask any of the witnesses: are there any opportunities that we might have using the IMF, using some of our international organizations and lending platforms? Is there any a requirement that we disallow or we prevent the acquisition of these major ports by the Chinese Communist government. Mr. Atienza.
Thank you for the question. I think the way in which we should look at this issue is try to think about how to turn things around. So if there are capital needs, why is it the Chinese that are providing? Who else can provide, and in which terms that will help support? So that's a way of turning it around. And if they benefit from the lack of transparency and for the lack of rules, why not set a rules-based system? Even the Paris Club that we know has clear rules and all members work well with each other is just an informal club. So my colleagues, Dr. Gelpern and Dr. Lino already spoke to the need to have an architecture that's strong enough so that everyone will have to abide. I think moving in these two directions, in the provision of finance for the right things and in the right terms, and in the provision of a rule set, a strong set of rules, including a system for debt management and debt restructuring, would be direct ways to go. That would be my take on this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gelpern, could you add to that? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, if I may amplify, first of all multilateral banks have negative pledge clauses that prohibit debtors from pledging collateral, or at least restrict it heavily without going to the banks. They've got to be made more uniform and revisited and taken more seriously. And then IMF and the World Bank put out a paper before COVID hit on the rise in collateralized debt, where the collateral is unrelated to the revenue generated project. And discouraging that, I think that we can be a lot more muscular in the institutions, the multilaterals can be a lot more muscular in encouraging collateral only when it's a revenue generating project that actually has returns in terms of human development.
Could I jump in on that as well quickly?
Mr. Now?
Yes.
Yep.
I would also point out, and I'm sure that you realize this in your travels, that these types of terms are very unpopular on the ground once they become well known. So emphasizing, again, transparency from both the debtor side and also the creditor side, especially because some range of these contracts might have been eased in the facilitated by side payments, right? I think this means that we need transparency from both sides so that these types of things become known on the ground by the broader citizenry and they can object to it at the time.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you for your good courtesy.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, and I thank you to our witnesses for spending time discussing this important and prevalent issue with us today. China's economic infiltration across developing countries has grown very worrisome. We've known for some time that the Chinese RMB is prone to manipulation, and this means that we must look to ensure that anything the RMB touches is not undermined by activity from the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Bank of China. To address these concerns, I'm now working on the Chinese Currency Accountability Act. The IMF's special drawing rights are comprised of 5 of the world's largest currencies, including the RMB. The bill would require that the United States oppose and vote against any increase in the RMB inclusion of the SDR currency basket, unless the Treasury Secretary can provide a report to this committee and to the Senate Banking Committee that certifies China is abiding by fair monetary practices. Effectively, this would ensure that there would be no RMB increase in the currency basket unless China adheres to the principles of the Paris Club. I look forward to working with the subcommittee and my colleagues on holding China accountable to the same standards that the rest of the world is abiding by. A question for Mr. Morris. In your testimony, you state that suggesting that these borrower countries could selectively default on their legal obligations to Chinese lenders is misguided and would ultimately be damaging to the countries. Could you explain a little more as to why this is a bad idea for those countries to selectively default on debt?
Thank you, Congressman. I think as much as we do view China as a singular actor, and certainly just in the scale of its lending for a lot of these countries, it stands out. nonetheless, it is a creditor, among creditors. And I think the challenge for borrowing countries is if you default on a single creditor, whether it's China or any other, it's going to make your life more difficult more generally as a borrower for all creditors, because you're violating the terms of a contract you made. Maybe I'll leave it at that. I know that Dr. Gelpern can speak to this issue from deep expertise.
Yeah, so just to pick up there, and I'll open it up, but what kinds of tools could the U.S. use more effectively in our kit bag, and how could developing countries interact with the United States? In their, they've already gotten caught in the snare that China laid for them when they've taken some of these debt instruments. What kind of tools do we have, and how could we work with some of these countries?
Well, thank you. If I could just emphasize, in my recommendations, I started by emphasizing the financing these countries have during this crisis, which is a little bit at odds. We're talking about the debt vulnerabilities they face. So it seems odd to be thinking about new financing coming in. But I think we have to find ways to get money into these economies as they grapple with this crisis. And that means financing terms that are appropriate to their circumstances. I think the best way to do that is to give our full support to institutions like the World Bank and the IMF so that they can be stepping up at a time, by the way, that Chinese lending has actually fallen off a lot. So for a lot of these countries, on a net basis, they are paying a lot more back to the Chinese than they are receiving in new loans. So that's, all the more a drag on their economies. And I think all the more reason why the lenders that reflect our values and our way of doing things could be stepping up right now.
Yeah, so I'd open up to the panel. There is already a problem within countries that have taken on too much debt. What short of just pumping U.S. dollars into other countries, frankly, at a time when they're needed in our own, what kinds of tools could we use to work with these countries?
If I can speak to that, I would just say that there are some obvious ones. We've lost the chance, in my view, in this 2020 year of providing debt cancellation to countries that were already under strong debt distress. And I think that's a road to go. It's not new cash. Of course, it has some impact, but it's much cheaper than postponing the crisis and putting a new pile of resources on countries. And second would be the countries need ODA, they need additional aid, and they need concessional financing. Concessional financing can allow them to cope with repaying back, but with a grace period and with low interest rates, and that can make the matching.
Yep, thank you. And my time, unfortunately, has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, and to the ranking member, and thank you, Chairwoman Waters. I do want to say to our expert witnesses, thank you. I hope you will forgive me for moving between this important subcommittee hearing and a markup in judiciary, so don't take my in and out as anything other than trying to do two jobs at once. But I do thank the witnesses. Professor Gelpern, I wanted to start with you. Could you go into greater depth as to the opaqueness of Chinese foreign lending policies and what concrete steps we can take for greater transparency?
This is probably something that I should share with Dr. Horn, who's looked at the numbers, and I've looked at the contracts. So look, the contracts have inordinately expansive confidentiality terms, and more so in recent years. The really interesting thing to me is that there are carve-outs for disclosure required by law. Well, then let's require disclosure by law. My preference is to start with the borrowing countries because, as Professor Leno has said, there needs to be accountability to the people whose work is repaying the debt, right? But I think that any legal statutory requirement of disclosure would actually take the wind out of a lot of these contractual terms. And just to flag, and I think this connects to the G7, the French have very similar confidentiality clauses. So going through the G7 actually is a very good idea, because China can always point to AFD and say, hey, we're no different.
Dr. Horn, do you want to add to that?
No, I fully agree with what Professor Gelpan has said. Maybe just to add one additional suggestion. I'm fully in favor of having a global debt census, in which we try to create a global database that has detailed and comprehensive loan-level data on sovereign debt. And that, of course, that requires information sharing from both the debtors and the creditors, but having that in place, perhaps hosted by an international organization such as the World Bank, I think will help to raise the pressure on those creditors that refuse to disclose.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Professor Leno, could you please offer us a little greater detail about the concern you raised in your testimony regarding the corruption in Chinese lending practices? In addition to simple bribery, and that seems like a crazy oxymoron, simple bribery, are there other criminal aspects that we should be considering when talking about Chinese sovereign debt deals?
So on the specific issues of Chinese lending, I think that some of my fellow witnesses might be able to speak more fully on particular issues. But I think in general, you're highlighting that corruption is an issue, and it can distort the way sovereign lending is done, and particular sovereign debt terms is a major problem. I mean, of course, this is not just Chinese entities. This is a broader issue in the international financial architecture. So I think we need to think about dealing with that problem, and again, embedding our response to Chinese issues in a more broader international approach, because I think that is much more likely to stick. I think that's been one of the themes on this hearing, and I want to emphasize that. So if you're thinking about this broader approach in which you're enmeshing Chinese lending, right, I think you need to remember that it takes two to tango, or sometimes more than two to tango. So you really need a multi-pronged approach, right? So first, we want to think about constraining the capacity of corrupt officials in these borrowing countries to hide funds, right? Because that's going to limit incentives for the type of corruption that we're thinking about, both straight up bribery and also the use of sort of side accounts and like middlemen and these other types of more hidden mechanisms that are not, pay for play direct bribery, but are akin to that, right? So we want to make sure that any of these types of funds become more easily discoverable. So strengthening efforts to target tax havens and to discover ultimate beneficial owners of shell corporations would help, right? In addition, I think we need to make clear that bad faith creditors can't recover on debt, right? They should be sure that the debt signing authority actually exists in these countries. And so this emphasis on clarifying laws and making sure that there are laws in place in the borrower countries for this, I think would help a lot. And again, I think creditor side transparency in lending is very important, especially when there are debtor side corruption concerns. So I think you really need to think about this as a whole package in which Chinese actions are embedded.
I thank you. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our great panel. This is an awesome and very timely discussion. So I do thank the chairman and the ranking member and the witnesses. I want to start my questions with Dr. Horn. So I think that the instinct when we talk about how do we combat this and what sort of counter do we have, I think the instinct is to say, okay, let's look at our multilaterals as a counterweight to what China's doing. And I think that makes sense in some respects. Having said that, I'm skeptical that the World Bank and the IMF are equipped to do that, only because my impression from speaking with former executive directors at the World Bank and folks who are very familiar with the World Bank is that China in many ways have blocked any attempt at getting the transparency that we want because of their shareholder rights and their ability to build coalitions inside the World Bank. So I guess my first question, and by the way, I say that as somebody who supports the World Bank. I think these multilaterals, they're necessary despite their frustrations. And so I think we do need to support them. But that being said, Dr. Horn, my first question is one: do you agree with the perspective that the World Bank has not been as effective as we might hope vis-a-vis transparency because of China's influence? And then, if yes, should we be looking to create an alternative, either through the D10 or the G7 or some sort of alternative financing mechanism that can push back on this stuff?
No, I'm not familiar with the internal discussions within the World Bank and debt transparency and what has slowed the progress. My personal observation is that there has been progress over the course of the last couple of months. One specific example is the publication of creditor compositions of the international public debt data, which I think is the first time that an official institution has really put quantities out there, has tried to, or has published the actual debt stocks that I think these countries owe to China. So I think that has been a significant step forward. I also share your initial statement that these multilateral institutions will need to play a very important role in making offers to these countries that lessens their dependence on China when it comes to spending for infrastructure and energy. So I think one more general point that I would like to make is that part of the attractiveness of Chinese lending for these countries over the course of the past years and the past decade has really been the lack of alternatives when it comes to financing large-scale projects in high-risk countries. And I think to do that and to offer these countries alternatives, the multilateral institutions will need to play a key role.
Thank you. Professor Gelpern, do you have any thoughts on that? Is your perspective that China has not, or I guess what would you say to the initial claim that the World Bank and the IMF have largely been blocked due to Chinese influence from demanding the type of transparency that we would need?
I wouldn't say blocked. I would say occasionally gummed up. I mean, I would, and it is a meaningful distinction in my mind. I do want to refocus attention on something Mr. Morris said, which is Chinese lending is going down, their net repayments. And the really interesting question now is what's going to replace that right at the time when countries accumulated unprecedented amounts of debt in 2020. We haven't had defaults. Why? Because countries that maybe shouldn't have borrowed up a storm. And so we're facing a delicate moment right now. And I do think that's where multilaterals can come in. I mean, IDA can borrow. IDA is enormously conservative, right? They can borrow, and that would diminish any given shareholder's influence in some sense.
Yeah.
May I speak to something that you said, Representative Gonzalez? So you began by expressing concern about the possible politicization of the World Bank and the IMF. And I agree with Professor Gelpern that gumming up is more accurate than blocked. I would emphasize that I think the U.S. needs to maintain its voice in these institutions rather than withdraw, right? Because I think withdrawing from these institutions is not the way to go. I also do think, though, that, given the changing balance of power over time, the U.S. should consider support for an independent expert institution, because experts from every country basically agree on what's needed. And so if we want to be supporting that, then an independent institution, even a consultative one, is not a bad idea.
Thank you. I'm not as sanguine about the World Bank. I agree we absolutely need to be at the table, and we need to be leading at the World Bank to the extent that we can. But absent that, I do hope we consider alternatives. But with that, I yield back. Thank you.
The time has expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I guess my first question is about the G20 Common Framework. My understanding is that China agreed to participate in the G20's Common Framework. How does one reconcile China's participation in the Common Framework with China's insistence on the No Paris Club clause? And I guess that Professor Gelpern?
Sure, and I think that also Mr. Morris may have more political economy color to add, but look, the clauses all predated last November. Some of them very recently predated. We have some contracts in 2020 that have these clauses, but We don't have anything since the common framework. It's embarrassing, right? They need to get up and say, they and we need to get up and say, now that there's the common framework, nobody's going to ask for this and nobody's going to enforce what's there now. Otherwise, it's just, why would you sign up for something just to be publicly embarrassed? I mean, that I'm being simplistic here.
Can I
What do you
add to that?
Your organization did the aid data report, if I understand correctly, and what is China's end game? Is China seeking repayment, or is debt a means to an end? I'm thinking of the case of Sri Lanka, which could not repay the debt, and so instead of repaying the debt, Sri Lanka ceded control of a port to China or an entity of China. And I'm wondering, is it more important to China to be repaid, or is it more important to leverage debt financing as well as integrated project delivery to secure control of other countries' strategic assets? What's the end game here?
Congressman, I think I'll come in on that question. I think our interpretation as authors of this study is that, we view these features as very aggressive measures to get repaid. That basically, and there are different interpretations, but I think ours would be that particularly lending into high-risk debt environments, we are, measures like these cash accounts, other kinds of offshore accounts, are features that the lender is using to protect itself. But that's one interpretation, and it can exist alongside other interpretations about broader strategic goals that the Chinese government might have, which is why the other features that we point to, these very broadly written provisions that implicate policy issues in the two countries. There's a lot of room for maneuverability there on the part of the Chinese government, and it's interesting that they would write those features into the contracts. And I think it does speak to legitimate concerns we can have from a U.S. perspective about the degree of leverage that the government might have in these situations. And it doesn't, they don't need to be lending countries into default deliberately in order to find sort of avenues for strategic influence in these countries.
And this might be a challenging question to answer, but China has an ever-expanding web of debt contracts with collateral clauses and confidentiality clauses, and all of these contracts contribute toward a lack of debt transparency. And it seems to me these loans are structured to undermine multilateral institutions and the debt restructuring initiatives of those institutions. Like, how close are we to reaching the point of no return, where these contracts are just so widespread that will derail the debt restructuring initiatives of multilateral institutions like G20 and others?
Contracts are not the 10 Commandments, right? I mean, and at a certain point, they backfire. If you have a really brittle contract, all that happens is your debtor defaults, and then what? So I think we need to leverage the self-interest here. Now, Congressman, you're exactly right. Sovereigns are sovereign.
If I could just, if you're a low-income country, the cost of defaulting and alienating a country as powerful as China could be quite high. So
you're right, but
you can lose access to markets.
But today we have very diverse lenders and lots of them. So in some ways, playing creditors against one another can play against us or in favor of a more constructive financing model. And I think really it's about turning the ship around rather than a point of no return. I don't think we're there. But
thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, is recognized for 5 minutes. Did we lose Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor? Okay, hearing nothing from Mr. Taylor, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Hill, for convening this very important hearing. And of course, thank you to all the witnesses who came to shed light on this complicated topic. I know it's easy to get abstract when we talk about the impact of global debt, but my constituents know we're talking about people's lives too. I'm from Chicago, and when our interest rates go up in Chicago and Cook County, we worry about pension cuts. I have a large Puerto Rican community in my district. The loved ones are trying to rebuild the island while needed investments are going to bondholders on Wall Street. So if countries around the world have to cut their budgets to make debt payments, when it's whether it's China or Wall Street, I worry that it'll be impossible for us to recover from this pandemic. Mr. Atienza, your testimony painted an alarming picture of the global economy during COVID-19, but many of the existing debt relief programs are only focused on small or very low income countries. Are larger economies like Mexico or Nigeria also likely to run into debt issues due to COVID-19? And does that jeopardize recovery for all of us?
Thank you for your question, Representative Garcia. Definitely there are middle-income countries that are in debt trouble. I wouldn't mention Mexico in that stance at this point, but definitely Nigeria, that is part of this initiative, is a large economy with deep troubles. And what we are seeing is that problems with debt are quite widespread, but we are finding, or ways are being found of providing new liquidity that hides to some extent the depth of this crisis and postpones it. Our take is that we are going to need to set new mechanisms to protect countries from the worst in this debt storm, and we're going to need debt cancellation. It's a bit of a lost opportunity that nothing else was done under DSSI, just postponing with the crisis going deeper. Payments to 2022-26 is not good enough, and we need to include definitely mechanisms that allow for debt cancellation for middle-income countries that are under severe debt stress. And there are plenty of those, and definitely protecting and setting provisions to protect the citizens in countries in these situations is going to be an important step forward. And I want to add that you need civil society oversight, and you need the eyes and the testimony of ordinary people to speak to the impacts of this debt crisis and to the reality that this COVID crisis is not going better yet because the uncertainties and the slow path of vaccination in developing countries is not allowing for. So all our previsions and all the numbers that we are reading are too optimistic currently. We need to be ready for things getting worse and for action coming forward urgently.
Thank you for that. Professor Lenau, in your testimony, you mentioned the importance of a fair, transparent restructuring process. We see in Puerto Rico how difficult restructuring can be and how important it is to get the process right. Can you talk about international efforts underway to create a fair restructuring mechanism for sovereign debt and what Congress can do to support them?
Yes, thank you for the question. So there are important mechanisms or processes underway to try to improve debt restructuring. I think the current discussion, the move toward the common framework, including a broader range of countries and creditors in that, I think is very important. I think that in addition, though, we need to take broader steps because I believe that this is just an initial step, and we need to take additional steps on both the sort of transparency side and on the actual fair restructuring side. We need to think more broadly about including not just public creditors, but also private creditors, as you pointed out, because different countries and different entities like Puerto Rico are differently exposed to public as opposed to private approaches. I think comparability of treatment in the common framework is one way to try to encourage the collaboration and coordination that is so essential, but it's not going to be sufficient because, as you point out, a very small range of countries are covered. And also because it's very difficult to encourage private creditors, in addition to public creditors, to participate in that. So we need to think a little bit more broadly, both in terms of improving contract mechanisms to make sure that they're not just within a certain type of contract like bonds, but also include a broader range. We need to think about domestic legislation, including legislation that I believe is under consideration in New York. And we need to think more seriously about international mechanisms, even beyond the ones that are under consideration right now. I think it takes a multi-track approach.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, for convening this hearing today. I found this really, really edifying. I want to focus on China's practices as they relate to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the effect on geostrategy in the South China Sea. After World War II, the most important alliances and stabilization for the Pacific were the United States relationships with Japan, with South Korea, with implicit security guarantees for Taiwan, our relationship with Australia. And now the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, the Asean states, are some of the fastest growing economies in the world. Their political heft is growing, and they've become the next battleground to be won in terms of influence in the Indo-Pacific. Partly because of the United States' failure to join in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we left a vacuum in ASEAN. And China has filled that with more than $100 billion worth of infrastructure loans and investments. I'll leave this question open for any of our witnesses who wish to answer it. Can you explain how China has been using cancellation, acceleration, stabilization contracts to influence the foreign policy of the ASEAN states in regards to its aggressive actions in the South China Sea, and what the United States might be able to do in working with ASEAN debtors to push back on these aggressive actions in the South China Sea?
Congressman, maybe I'll come in on this. I mean, I guess I would say two things. One is just to observe, entirely separate from these loan contracts, we do have to appreciate the nature of influence that comes with the scale of lending that you just described. This volume of financing just inherently creates significant leverage when it's between two governments, as it is in many of these cases. And as you said, while we are looking at China lending globally, there's no question that there's a particular concentration in Southeast Asia, and it is, it is inextricably linked with a broader range of objectives on the part of the Chinese government that isn't strictly commercial or economic. I guess with all of that in mind, it's particularly striking then to be able to look at these debt contracts and see that on top of all that, the Chinese lenders, government-owned lenders, have taken that step of making explicit this kind of leverage, that basically by writing pretty aggressive, broad terms to enable cancellation, acceleration, in ways that we can read into a lot of different kinds of behavior. To be honest, speculative on our part, because it's hard to observe in practice what this looks like. It's not transparent, but it is striking that these are written into the contracts.
And Mr. Morris, are we seeing already evidence that the ASEAN states, I mean, ASEAN as a coordinating body is not particularly muscular yet in the Indo-Pacific affairs, but are we seeing evidence that they are being muted in their response to Chinese actions in the South China Sea because of the investments and the loans they're getting from China?
I'll avoid speaking directly to that, but more broadly, I would say I'm actually struck by, there is an opportunity here for the U.S. The degree to which, there is political blowback in the region, certainly to China's lending behavior. There is a desire to diversify sources of financing, and I think as we heard from the other witnesses, that at the citizen level there is discomfort and resistance to their own governments as they've taken on these commitments that feel like there are strings attached and broader implications. So I think there is an opportunity for us.
how can the United States use the potential for reentry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership or some updated version of that to provide a counterbalance in ASEAN states?
I do think the trade agenda is an important instrument. One thing I would say, though, is that if you look back historically, the U.S. has emphasized trade agreements as sort of a leading instrument of our foreign policy. That has fallen off a lot in recent years, obviously. What we have not emphasized that the Chinese have is financing, direct investment, lending, equity stakes. And, I think we have to grapple with that as a part of our toolkit.
I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman from Massachusetts' time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, thank you for letting me participate in this subcommittee. I was chair of the Asia subcommittee back on May 8th, 2019, when we had hearings focused very much on the same subject. I want to observe that China providing capital to poor countries to help them develop is often a good thing. These loans are risky for China, and the most important loans, the most important financing in the world is when lenders aren't willing to take a risk. But we need to be concerned about 3 areas. One is when the loan is unfair, particularly when it's a trap designed, as it may have been in Sri Lanka, to make the loan not with the idea that it would ever be repaid, but as a way to seize the underlying security. The second issue that arises is aid or concessionary loans or financing a foreign policy bribe, encouragement? And we do that too. We give aid and concessionary loans to countries hoping that they will support American foreign policy. And if we're going to compete with China around the world, I'd much rather the competition be who can do the most to help poor countries and to compete for their votes at the UN or diplomatic support than it be a competition as to who can build the most aircraft carriers. A third issue that arises is the confidentiality. And that particularly concerns me because if I gather what our witnesses are testifying, China insists that the borrower not disclose the debt, which makes it impossible then for the borrower to be honest with its citizens and to be honest with other lenders. Do I have this right that countries agree or even companies agree not to disclose their debts to China or Chinese entities to their citizens or to others they may be seeking credit from?
President, the answer is yes, but
I mean, isn't that fundamentally illegal? I mean, if you then go to another lender and you say, here are a list of all my debts, do you then put a little note at the bottom and say, except for the ones to China, which I'm not disclosing to you?
You're breaching the contract.
Fraud doesn't count. I promised China that I would defraud the next lender. So the fraud is good fraud because I did it at Beijing's request.
Sir,
what is the good fraud here?
There is no good fraud, right? I think there's broad-based agreement on that. I think the only qualification to all of this is that we've got the agreements, either because we have 100, that's 5% or however much, either because they're legal requirements or because somebody leaked. These are all from public sources. What we need is an international.
If I can interrupt for a second, the response of America should be, please, if you enter into an unfair contract with China or a contract where you are required to conceal it from other debtors, including us, then please don't repay. And in order to encourage you not to repay, we will instruct all of the lending agencies under our control not to count it against your credit. Many countries will repay China because they want to maintain a good relationship with China. But at some point, the debt to China will be so enormous that the opportunity to just stiff them completely and not have it count against their credit rating anywhere else will be very inviting. Or the opportunity to use that opportunity to negotiate with China will be helpful. So for when we evaluate a country's credit and count defaults to China, we are acting in effect as China's a debt collector. Perhaps you have a comment.
The trouble is that we don't have that leverage, right? I mean, we're not in a position to tell private creditors not to call a default or rating agencies to downgrade. So
you don't know the power of our committee. We do have control of the credit rating agencies. I yield back.
Well,
Ms. Gelper, I'll give you a few seconds to respond. You were starting a sentence there.
Well, just that the victims are going to be the countries. That's my concern, right? That if we had all the control and all the money, and if we could replace all the liquidity, I suppose we could consider that. But Paris Club creditors are 5% of, including us, of a lot of these countries' debts. So who are we talking to? Who's the audience?
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Ms. Gelpern. The chair does not see or know of members seeking time. Going once.
If I could seek 30 seconds.
Ms. Sherman, you're recognized for 30 seconds.
I just want to respond. This would, what I'm suggesting would just be an option for a country to use. And if they thought it wasn't in their interest, they wouldn't use it. And I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Seeing no additional members, I'd like to extend a hearty thanks to all of the witnesses for a fascinating conversation and a lot to follow up on today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able if you get such questions. Without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. With that, I thank our witnesses once again, and this meeting is adjourned.